Hello, everyone. This is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for continued support. Today's video is going to be another needlessly deep dive into a martial class. Y'all really seem to enjoy my previous one, the Investigator, linked above, and it generated a lot of interesting discussions, and it seemed to have changed some minds on the Investigator, and I enjoyed talking to all of you about it. So today, I wanted to talk about a class that represents what might be one of the most popular styles of character in high fantasy media. The Spell Sword, the Spell Blade, the Gish as D&D and adjacent communities call it, and any number of other names. Basically a character that blends martial might and magical power into their style, into all of the cool and awesome things they do in combat and or for utility outside of combat. And of course, the class that I'm talking about is the Magus. Arguably one of the most interesting classes in the game, and definitely one of the most discussed classes in the game. And today we'll be doing a deep dive of that class. Before getting into the Magus though, I wanted to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Crystal Maggie. Crystal Maggie is an online store that you can use to purchase accessories for all of your in-person TTRPG needs. Recently, they sent me this box with a phoenix emblem that I can use to keep all of my dice. And the dice themselves, of which I'll put pictures on the screen, have dragon skulls embedded inside them. And of course, if you see dragon skulls embedded inside a die, you might be concerned that these dice might be weighted incorrectly. So I did the only obvious thing and ran a simulation and tested them hundreds of times to ensure that they give expected uniformly distributed outputs. And they absolutely do. So I definitely recommend checking them out. There is a link in the video description below that'll let them know that I sent you, and if you use the code Mathfinder at checkout, you will get a discount on your purchase, and I will get a little bit of a commission from that. Now, let's get back into the video. So let's talk about Magus Discourse as a whole before we can start analyzing the Magus itself. It has always been a class that has sort of been a magnet for discussion. And of course, more so now than ever because of the remaster that it got, which I did a deep dive on in the video linked above. But the gist is, it is one of the most changed classes in the game with the remaster. Either the most or the second most, depending on whether you're thinking the Oracle was changed more or not, and that's definitely gotten it a lot of attention. But the reason I want to embed us firmly into some context before we do our own discussion and analysis is that I think there's an incorrect tendency to view the Magus as being all about Spellstrike. And until we quash that myth, there's simply no discussing the class as a whole. Because a lot of discussions about the Magus simply don't want to look at the class as a whole. They read Spellstrike and stop there. And that actually makes me a little sad, because I think the Magus is one of the most interesting classes in Pathfinder, and the best Gish I have ever seen in any D&D-like game. I think it captures the fantasy of martial might and magical prowess blending together in such a fun and cool and versatile way, and none of that is visible if you believe in it just being Spellstrike, the class. And a lot of the times when I bring up discourse that I'm responding to, I have commenters reassuring me that this perception isn't really all that common and questioning where I even saw this perception in some cases. And in a lot of those cases, this is just a matter of variance. The circles I interact with might be different than the circles that commenter interacted with. But with this tendency, I feel pretty comfortable saying this is a common perception, because I've seen it outside the Pathfinder 2nd Edition community. I've seen Pathfinder 1st Edition players who believe in myths about the 2nd Edition Magus. I have seen D&D players who believe in myths about the Magus not being as versatile as something like, say, the Eldritch Knight even. I have seen players in the wider RPG community just talking about the Magus being a spammy and boring class. I do feel pretty comfortable saying that this is a common perception and an incorrect one. And again, I usually don't use words like just dismissing something as being incorrect. There's usually a grain of truth at the center of most myths. There's usually a matter of table variance or perceptions behind most things that I consider not all that accurate. But with Magus Spellstrike spam, I feel pretty comfortable saying it is just incorrect. I don't think it is a good way to play the class. I don't think the class is signposted to be played that way. And I think Paizo has taken multiple attempts at signposting even more than before that you shouldn't play the class this way, and somehow this perception persists. And even if you have not seen this myth directly, the idea that Magus is all about Spellstrike spelled out as a sentence, you have probably seen these various other myths about the Magus, all of which stem from the same myth. For starters, you have probably seen people talk about how you must Spellstrike every single turn for good DPR, that your DPR will fall behind with even a single turn of not attempting a Spellstrike. Taken to an extreme, there are some folks who think Magus damage flatly just sucks unless you take a focus spell like pre-nerf amped imaginary weapon or fire ray or something along those lines and bolt that onto your Spellstrike. And of course, between all this talk about spike damage with Spellstrikes, you will find people just dismissing save spells out of hand. So I think early last year is when this happened, but Paizo errata the Magus to be able to make Spellstrikes with save spells against single targets. And this has carried forward into the recent remaster as well. And of course, expansive Spellstrike has always existed, but this was an errata to the baseline Spellstrike. And I remember the reception to it being overall ambivalent because a lot of folks were just like, well, I'm gonna dump intelligence anyways, so this is suboptimal. And a lot of folks dismissed it based on that. And a more extreme version of this is just the notion of casting a spell at all without spell striking is so irrelevant that you should just dump intelligence, even in favor of a tertiary stat like charisma. Then you will see folks talking about how the melee Magus just sucks because your action economy is so harsh between spell striking and recharging that you'll never be able to do anything that you actually want to do. This is often taken as a point that only the Starlit span Magus is viable to play and the others all kind of suck because of their inconvenient action economy, with Laughing Shadow being probably the only other melee exception as far as community perception goes. I've seen people dismiss Inexorable Iron, Twisting Tree, Unfurling Brocade, all of them as being bad because you will never get to use any of their cool features, supposedly because of how inconvenient your action economy is. And to be clear, I don't believe a majority of players believe any one of these myths. You'll probably find a small minority of players who believe that Laughing Shadow is the only viable melee Magus. You'll find another small minority of players who believe that Starlit span turret spamming is the only viable way to play a Magus. Charisma Maguses, again, a small portion of them are the ones talking about it. Never using save spells, another small portion. But when you add all of these small portions of people who believe in their own unique myths about the Magus, it all adds up to a pretty large chunk of the community pushing discussions from the lens of the Magus being just a Spellstrike user and very little else. And each of these myths is just one interpretation of how that lands for that player at their own tables. So before we get started on deeply analyzing the Magus, let's deeply analyze Spellstrike. Is it as good as people think? Is it so defining to the Magus that you should be spamming it? Is it so defining to the Magus, your spike damage that you can do with attack spells and spell strikes, that you shouldn't even consider alternatives? We are going to start with a crazy premise. Let's pretend that the psychic nerfs never happened. Let's pretend that we have pre-nerf amped imaginary weapon available and do a spike damage TTK analysis on the Magus based on those numbers. And I promise you the results are going to shock you because they shocked me and I already believed the Magus wasn't a spike damage spammer, and this only reinforces that. So we are going to do some math setup to eventually do an analysis very similar to the Vicious Swing video linked above, where I am going to do a level by level average TTK turns to kill breakdown to try and figure out, is the spike damage option worth using? But I am approaching this a little differently than Vicious Swing. Vicious Swing was very much a case where It was an option added on top of a character who could and should, in a lot of cases, default to making 2 strikes, especially if one of them is a press trait strike. The Magus is different. Spellstrike is a defining action for your class. My argument is not that Spellstrike is so bad that you should be considering making 2 strikes over it on a very regular basis. I don't think that is ever going to be true. Spellstrike is a huge part of your damage, and you're probably going to be using it frequently, but by the end of this video, I will have convinced you, hopefully, that Spellstrike is not the one and only thing Maguses do, and that they're meant to be versatile and doing a lot of things other than it too. So this analysis is not going to be comparing, say, a 2-action Spellstrike's damage versus just 2 strikes, because with or without Arcane Cascade, the Spellstrike is probably going to win that comparison, even if you account for the action tax imposed by recharge in a few cases. What I'm doing here instead is proving to you that the spike damage is very good, but not so good that it becomes over-centralizing. And to do that, I will be looking at a Starlit Span Magus with the composite shortbow. And the reason I'm using the Starlit Span first and foremost is because I think they have the best argument for spamming spell strikes. Bows have a great range. They don't have a reload action attached. Aside from cover, it's really hard to be in a situation where you're considering doing anything other than spell striking. So if spell strike spam is fundamentally the best way to play a Magus, the Starlit Span Magus is where we can learn that lesson. And again, because of just the realities of operating at range, the simulation I do here is going to land much closer to the reality of how a Starlit Span Magus will play turn after turn than if I do a melee simulation. I will still do a melee simulation later, and I will talk about them, but right now let's focus on the Starlit Span. For your weapon, I am assuming you have automatic bonus progression and a d6 damaging property room like Astral or Flaming or Frost at levels 8, 10, and 16. I'm assuming that at level 1 you have +2 strength, and then by level 10 you will have +4 strength. Remember that composite shortbows add half your strength as damage, so +2 at level 1 would mean +1 of a flat damage bonus, +4 at level 10 would mean +2 damage bonus, and it's not worth going past that because a +5 won't get you anywhere, and a +6 would be a hefty investment requiring your Apex item, which is not worth it. Now, we'll be looking at 3 different rotations, and again, the Starlit Span Magus is the likeliest to fall into repetitive rotations because of the convenience of operating at range. The first will be the Gouging Claw case, where on turn 1 you use Sure Strike followed by Spell Strike, and then on turns 2 and later you use Force Fang if you have a focus point, and then Spell Strike. And if you don't have a focus point, you will just recharge with a bespoke action. Obviously, this excludes level 1 from our analysis, where Force Fang is simply unavailable. I don't think excluding level 1 is an issue because level 1 is like that pathological level where the amount of overkill damage you do with a spell strike is so high that you're nearly one-shotting bosses and more than one-shotting anything on level or a minion in a lot of cases, so there's really not much to analyze there. Then I'll be considering an imaginary weapon case. This is a Magus who is only using imaginary weapon with their focus points, so they're not making use of Force Fang or any other conflux spell. Obviously, this section of the analysis starts at level 6. For the sake of focus points, this means that the imaginary weapon Maguses always have 3 focus points, because by level 6, you could still have picked up Psychic Dedication at level 4, and then imaginary weapon by level 6. So you will have 3 focus points by level 6. I will also be assuming that the Gouging Claw Magus has 2 focus points at level 2 and 3 by level 6 for many of the same reasons, because it's not hard to find your last focus point as needed. And the imaginary weapon Magus's rotation will be Sure Strike plus Amped Spell Strike on turn 1. I know I said if possible there, but that's just a copying thing. Obviously, you can Spell Strike with an Amp on turn 1, and then on future turns, you will do Recharge plus Spell Strike, and only Amp if you have a focus point available. So your Recharge is a bespoke action in this case. And finally, there's a third rotation that I'll be titling All Out, which is just imaginary weapon, but rather than using Recharge every single time, the first time they recharge, they will use Force Fang instead. So it goes turn 1, Sure Strike plus amped Spellstrike, turn 2, Force Fang plus amped Spellstrike, turn 3 onwards, you will use Recharge plus unamped Spellstrike. And to be clear, when you're out of focus points in both of the latter two cases, I will be talking about non-amped imaginary weapon. And the reason I'm including this third rotation is because previously when I have talked about the disadvantage of imaginary weapon eating away from your Force Fang and other conflict spell focus points, I have been told that, well, nothing's stopping you from just using both, and that it's actually really good to just be using both. So let's put that to the test. Let's look at this all-out, no-holds-barred expenditure where you are willing to spend all of your focus points in turns 1 and 2. The foe is a level +2 boss with high AC, and this time I set a threshold of 35% of moderate HP to mark a kill. The reason I set 35% here was so I can purposely benefit the all-out case. In my Vicious Swing analysis before, I actually used 50% of moderate HP as my threshold because that is what I consider comfortable amounts of damage for a party's primary damage dealer to deal before I feel like saying, yes, I'm so good at damage that I can carry the party through a stroke of bad luck too if needed. But I purposely went well below that because I was like, I don't want my simulations to artificially make the all-out case look worse, because with the Vicious Swing analysis, the TTKs were pretty high. They were in the 4 to 6 range, and obviously such a TTK will disproportionately benefit the more focus spell conservative options compared to all-out. So I brought the threshold in. I think 35% is as low as I'm willing to go, though. Like, I'm not going to do 25% because at that point, you're not a good damage dealer, you're an average damage dealer if you're only dealing a quarter of your party's damage. So 35% is, in my opinion, as low as one can reasonably go on HP thresholds. And note here that I did in fact run the test with 50%. I'm not like omitting data from you on purpose. It just made the all-out case so much worse that it wasn't worth discussing. So I figured I'd leave a more interesting discussion here by lowering the threshold. And as before, we will be calculating the mean TTK for each rotation on each level between 2 to 20 and 6 to 20, depending on when these rotations become available. And note here that the reason I did not include any kind of a 2-strike rotation like I did against Vicious Swing is because it would just be plainly bad. The Starlit Span Magus doesn't even get Arcane Cascade damage bonus to their strikes. They are very much intended to be using spell strikes as their go-to damage option, and the only reason you would consider making a regular strike rather than a spell strike is if you have something else to do in that turn. And we will talk about those something else's as we get deeper into the video, but this is the spell strike subclass making as many spell strikes as possible. So what is the verdict? Is it worth over-investing in your spell strikes with things like amps? Well, would I be making this long-ass video for you if there were no interesting conclusions to share? Of course not. The verdict is that you definitely should not be spamming imaginary weapon for damage. So as before, the x-axis of this is level ranges, 2 up till 20. The y-axis is your turns to kill, on average, for that level. Lower is better, because lower means you dropped an enemy to 0 HP faster. The blue line is our baseline. This is the one where on turn 1 you use Sure Strike and Gouging Claw Spellstrike, and then use Force Fang to recharge, followed by another cantrip Spellstrike. The red line is the one where you saved all your focus points for imaginary weapon, and your TTK is substantially worse. About 1 round worse on average. And 1 round is sort of that like sweet spot for TTK where you can, in the vast majority of cases, notice the difference. Because when you say you have a 0.5 round worse TTK, at that point, there's factors like who won initiative, how lucky you got in that very last round that can make one TTK get ahead of the other. Even if on average, one of them has a faster TTK, there's still going to be a substantial number of times where the other got the faster TTK. But with the red line, once you're 1 round worse, you're almost always getting a worse TTK, which means saving focus points for imaginary weapon is practically never worth it. It's almost always going to result in a worse TTK. The green line is the surprising result. There were some folks whom I have talked to in the past who assured me that the red line would be better than the blue. I never really understood how that would be the case. You can't just ignore the damage of Force Fang because it's inconvenient to you wanting to use imaginary weapon. But the green line was the one I was like, I can believe that it might be better than the blue line because you're using all of your resources up front. You're going to spike early kills. Of course you are. And then maybe the damage after is decent enough to not let you fall too far behind. But unfortunately, it's not. And to be clear, I did do a little zoom in and checked. Of course, the green line had more turn 2 kills than the blue line did. Of course it did. It's impossible for it not to. But there were enough turn 3 or later kills in both of the lines that once you got to that point, the blue line just pulled substantially ahead. Because as far as the green line goes, if you're not getting the turn 2 kill, you're probably not getting the turn 3 or 4 kill either. You're much more likely to go into the later turns because of the all or nothing nature of spell strikes. Once you're out of focus points, once you're at turns 3 or later, a single miss means 3 actions of 0 damage. And that has a substantial effect on TTK, which is why the baseline Magus won this contest. And I cannot emphasize enough, I gave imaginary weapon every advantage possible. I reduced the HP threshold on purpose to benefit the green line, to minimize the number of cases where combat even gets to turn 3. And I let them use amped imaginary weapon from before the nerf, a spell that no longer exists in the game, a spell that does 2d8 per rank and not 2d6. And despite all those advantages, your average TTK got worse. Now, to be clear, that's not to say imaginary weapon is bad or that focus spell striking is bad. It is a valuable tool that can increase your spike damage and help you land early kills. But it's not improving your TTK on average. So the assertion that it is necessary for good damage as a Magus isn't true, even on the Magus that gets to spam spell strikes. But come on, we can't just look at ranged Maguses. For the longest time, we only had one ranged subclass, and now we have 2, including the gun-using one. So what about melee? Melee is the focus of the Magus class for the most part. Let's talk about the Inexorable Iron Magus now with a D10 weapon. I think the Inexorable Iron Magus is the most white roomable melee Magus subclass because it has fundamentally good damage that is not conditional in any way. There are other Magus subclasses, like obviously Laughing Shadow, which can get slightly higher damage conditionally, but because of the conditional nature of it, they're inherently less white roomable. They don't make for good spreadsheet or mathematical analysis, whereas Inexorable Iron does. You only enter Arcane Cascade for a little bit of extra damage and your temp HP, so you never have to enter it for the sake of this analysis. Obviously, the strength investment is going to change. It's going to be +4 at level 1 and +7 by level 20. We're assuming the rune progression remains the same as before, though. Now, we'll be looking at 2 different rotations, and these rotations will have been altered from the ranged equivalents to account for the fact that you have to get into melee. First up, Gouging Claw. On turn 1, we stride in and Spellstrike. On turn 2, we Force Fang, and then enter Arcane Cascade, and then make a regular old strike. Turns 3 onwards, we Spellstrike, followed by either Force Fang or Recharge if we're out of focus points. Turn 2 might seem odd to you. Just intuitively, you're going to look at it and be like, Mathfinder, this worsens your TTK. There's no way for an Inexorable Iron Magus to benefit so much from Arcane Cascade that the extra damage offsets not having made one Spellstrike. And you're right, this is a strict downgrade to your White Room TTK. But one, I think it is a good idea to enter Arcane Cascade as this melee Magus because you're not in the White Room. And if you don't get your perfect 3 action rotation off on turns 3 and later, you'll have a much worse situation on your hands when you don't get to Spellstrike unless you have entered Arcane Cascade already. And this is even more true for the other Maguses, like the ones that rely on Arcane Cascade for boosted damage or extra traits or whatever else. And 2, you will see that despite worsening my TTK by not making a Spellstrike, this rotation is still competitive with the imaginary weapon rotation, which goes something like this. Turn 1 is the same, stride in, Spellstrike with the amp. Turn 2, you use Force Fang with Spellstrike Amp, and turns 3+, you use the bespoke recharge action, followed by an unamped Spellstrike. And note here, I did not impose the whole entering Arcane Cascade thing on the imaginary weapon Magus. I effectively gave them an additional Spellstrike over the Gouging Claw Magus. Please keep that in mind while looking at the chart on the next slide. All of the rest of the setup, including the boss you're against, the runes, the progression, etc., is the same as before. And the results look something like this. Again, same x-axis and y-axis as before. The blue line is the baseline, the Gouging Claw Magus. The green line is the imaginary weapon Magus. And again, for the majority of the levels, the blue line had the better average TTK. It is a much closer contest than before, mind you, where before there was like a half turn better TTK on average for the baseline for most levels except a handful like level 13 and 17. Here it's much closer. I can see justifications for using imaginary weapon much more often because you're basically gambling on that turn 2 kill. But as before, if you get to turn 3 or later, your TTK is getting substantially worse. So again, imaginary weapon was given all the advantages that it could be given, and it still came out to being noticeably, though not disastrously, behind at quite a few levels, pretty even for quite a few levels, like say 14 to 16, and then ahead at exactly 2 levels, like 13 and 17. Not a great showing for the amount of investment it requires, right? And not a great showing for the amount of hype it gets, because people talk so much about focus spells, spell striking, and this is what its TTK looks like? So with all of that math, what does it actually tell us? What does looking at the TTK give us in terms of actionable information? Well, the argument for this is going to take multiple slides because what this TTK analysis has done is effectively dismantled a whole bunch of old assumptions. Here are the 3 main assumptions that I narrowed down that, as far as I can tell, have always informed Magus optimization discourse. First up, the idea that when you get to use a focus spell to spell strike with, it is going to feel like a strict upgrade to Magus damage. Second, that spamming Spellstrike is a great way to improve your damage, even on a melee Magus. And third, that subclasses that rely on attack trait actions as part of their toolkit, like say Twisting Tree, are weaker because of these implicit assumptions on Spellstrike spam. Now TTK replaces those assumptions with new, well-substantiated conclusions. And to be clear, I understand that I'm questioning things that have been ingrained in the discourse since the Magus came out, basically. But I promise you, I have looked at it carefully. I got my simulations reviewed by other folks just to make sure I didn't miss anything. And yeah, like, I think it's pretty definitive. First up, amps and focus spells are side grades. They're not strict upgrades to your damage. If you spam them, your damage is going to go down, which means just like with Vicious Swing, there is a set of heuristics for when you should use them, and when those heuristics are true, you will use them for big spikes in damage, bigger than a normal Magus can manage, of course. But notably, when something isn't a strict upgrade, when it's just a side grade, that means its opportunity cost exists, it's real. We can't just ignore it. Thus far, discussions about the opportunity cost of getting Psychic Dedication and then getting Amped Imaginary Weapon, or after the errata, getting Cleric Dedication and then getting Fire Ray or something along those lines, have always come from this premise of expecting that it'll just give you a strict upgrade to your damage that your class couldn't have given you, and thus it's always worth the opportunity cost compared to every other option. But that's not true. They're not strictly upgrading your damage, which means that the feats you sink into them could have been spent on other things, so it's not free to have it around. Put another way, I know many of you watched my Vicious Swing video and came to the conclusion that it's like, well, I would like it if it was free in my class, but since it costs a level 1 feat, I still don't consider it worth it. And that's a valid conclusion, but then neither is Focus Spell spell striking, because you spend all these feats to get what is ultimately a side grade that requires judicious use in specific circumstances to feel like an upgrade and otherwise is a situational option. Then there are some subtler conclusions. For one, if you go back to those charts and take a look at them, the Magus' TTK got worse by closing into melee. This is very unintuitive because you expect melee characters to have higher TTK, especially in circumstances like this that are white roomed. Like, remember, I assumed you use one single stride to close in and otherwise got to use every other action in combat on just hurting your enemy. And with that, your TTK still was below a Starlit span Magus. And you might argue that I should have allowed that Magus to Spellstrike on turn 2 rather than going Force Fang plus Arcane Cascade plus regular old strike, right? But one, the imaginary weapon Magus did not have to do that on their second turn and still did not exceed the TTK of a Starlit span Magus. And two, I'm still being so generous with the assumptions. Like, clearly, the takeaway here is that with ideal circumstances, you still need to invest everything into Spellstrike to keep up with the Starlit span Magus, but you're not going to get to invest everything in a Spellstrike. You're gonna have turns where you do other auxiliary actions. You might stride, you might try to save yourself or an ally from a grab, anything really. So in fact, retroactively, this justifies having entered Arcane Cascade because that turns 3+ where I'm just going Spellstrike plus Force Fang or Recharge isn't guaranteed. There's gonna be many cases where it doesn't apply. So melee Maguses almost certainly shouldn't be spamming Spellstrikes. A Starlit span Magus can, like, I promise you, they can get away with it. Ranged characters oftentimes don't have to move that much. They take many fewer auxiliary actions than melee ones. I'm not saying they take none, but not having to take auxiliary actions is one of the main advantages of being at range. So melee Maguses almost certainly are not going to be spamming Spellstrikes. Instead, they should be using a whole mix of athletics. They're much stronger conflux spells, they're stronger Arcane Cascade boosts, and of course, they're strong melee strikes, all combined together to justify having been in melee at all. You don't close into melee with a plan of spamming Spellstrikes, because literally whatever plan you have, literally however you change the math, however you change my simulations, you're going to end up with the conclusion that the Starlit span Magus gets the better TTK. They simply will. You have to be exploiting the other advantages of being in melee to justify being in melee. It cannot just be the spike damage you get from Spellstrike. And finally, this now means that having versatile uses of attacks actually makes you better at the things that make melee worth it. The optimizers who dismissed options like Twisting Tree or whatever because they were like, I will just be Laughing Shadow or Inexorable Iron and do as much damage as possible with my very big damage, well, doing your very big damage by spamming Spellstrikes wasn't ever worth it. So now we should be looking at what can I be doing that's not spamming Spellstrikes and doing damage, and well, we have subclasses designed to do the opposite. So this is now the new set of assumptions. The old assumptions, throw them out of the window. Anyone doomsaying based on those old assumptions about how Fire Ray is now mandatory or the Magus did not receive the remaster they deserved, throw it all out of the window. Those assumptions don't hold. They don't hold to any scrutiny. These new assumptions, the ones that we can draw from a decently done White Room analysis, can now be extrapolated into real play where we leave the White Room, which is what we'll do on this next slide. So with that, we have pretty thoroughly dismissed the idea that the Magus is supposed to spam Spellstrike. We can now start approaching building and playing our Maguses from the perspective of what it actually is. We don't have to talk about those wrong premises anymore. What is the Magus? How are they intended to play? It is a martial spellcaster hybrid. You are meant to take the advantages of weapons and the advantages of spells and blend them. The intuitive answer is usually the right one in Pathfinder 2nd edition. I have ranted about this in my skill proficiencies video linked above, where at the end I talk about how it's rarely the case that Paizo is just put in an obviously bad option secretly meant to trick you. Most of the time, the people doing these like White Room math analyses just missed something obvious that was a flaw in their analysis, and that if you fix the flaw, you reach the intuitive answer that the way the thing is signposted to you is the way it's meant to play. The Magus is meant to use basic strikes, often boosted with Arcane Cascade or self buffs at least some of the time, in their rotation. You're meant to mix in athletics and recall knowledge as part of your rotations. And notably, this is a huge upside of two of the subclasses, Twisting Tree and Unfurling Brocade, because both of them are designed around a pet athletics action that they like to use. And even aside from those two, the other Maguses still want to use athletics if they're in melee a lot of the time. Recall Knowledge, of course, is just a side benefit of having intelligence that your spell DC scales off of. And of course, Starlit Span Maguses are not using athletics, but that's fine because you still have access to things like magical ammunition, and on top of that, I would argue that just because you can't use athletics like a melee Magus does, doesn't mean that you're going to be spamming Spellstrikes for damage. You have the benefit of being able to make a Spellstrike on almost every turn of combat. So use other Spellstrikes, right? Like, don't just do damage. Throw in a telekinetic maneuver. That is your athletics, if you think about it. So Starlit Span Maguses are still mixing it up with athletics maneuvers, even though they're not strength-based characters. You cast actual factual spells when needed. There are going to be times you just cast a fireball, a laughing fit, or a self-buff spell. Use Spellstrike with a save spell whenever needed. Use Spellstrike with a fear or a slow or a debuff of some kind, or sometimes just a half damage spell that does a save instead of an attack. And use Spellstrike with an attack spell if and only if you desire spike damage specifically, because Spellstrike with an attack spell is the single best single target spike damage option in the game. And this is where the tactical dynamic of the Magus is built from. Your first question on every round is, do I want spike damage right now? And if you don't, then the question becomes, what do I want to do? Do I still want a Spellstrike? Do I want to do something for continuous damage? Do I want something non-damaging? Do I have the time to set up a buff? And that is where we start building our Magus' play patterns. So let's talk about when and how to use spike damage as a Magus, because this is going to define everything else you do. You use Spellstrike for spike damage only when you believe that the spike damage is going to net you an upside. In theory, this is no different than Vicious Swing, and all spike damage options share these same baseline considerations. Is there an enemy low enough on HP that I expect one Spellstrike to kill where two strikes wouldn't? Am I bypassing a large resistance? Do I have a relevant one-use accuracy boost? Do I have a hero point? Do I have true target? Has a commander used Fortunate Blow or set up strike for me? Has somebody given aid to me? Can I create a situation where I ask for one of those boosts in some capacity? And a very important note here, that while I am comparing it to Vicious Swing on a high level, your spike is way bigger than Vicious Swing spike. So the answers for all of these should come up, yes, much more often than on Vicious Swing. Spike damage is always situational. Vicious Swing is way more situational, where there's going to be combats you use no Vicious Swing, and most of them are going to use one Vicious Swing. A Magus should almost never have a combat where they don't Spellstrike, and in the combats where they do, it might end up happening more than once, though sometimes you may not Spellstrike more than once. You might end up Spellstriking just the one time, sometimes. Now, beyond the baseline spike damage considerations that anyone should be having, and looking specifically at Magus considerations for spike damage, here are a few other factors that change whether you use Spellstrike or not. Am I going to have the ability to use a conflux spell to make my Spellstrike feel free in terms of its action economy? Up front, a Spellstrike is a 2-for-3 deal. You did a strike plus casted a 2-action spell, but you only did it for 2 actions. The reason it's not action compression is because you might later use the recharge action, which is like -1 action from that perspective. So you get ahead by 1 when you Spellstrike, and then you go behind by 1 when you use recharge, which is net 0. But when you use a conflux spell, you remain ahead. You got to recharge, but you also got to deal some nice mapless damage if it was Force Fang, or make a strike if it was one of your subclass-specific complex spells, or do something else useful if you have picked up one of the other complex spells. So this is probably your most important Magus-specific consideration that makes your spike damage much more usable than other spike damage options in the game. Then there's a factor of, can you draw aggro with your Arcane Cascade or a Conflux spell? This is often a consideration for Inexorable Iron Maguses or Sparkling Targe Maguses. You might want to Spellstrike to have a huge upfront burst in damage, and then improve your own defenses with either the temp HP of Arcane Cascade, or by like raising a shield and making a strike and something like that with Sparkling Targe, so that you can then survive the onslaught from the enemies, draw aggro off your party onto yourself. Then there's the question of, are my control options more relevant than spike damage right now? This is a question that is often going to come up for Twisting Tree or Unfurling Brocade Maguses, because there are going to be times where, despite having a Spellstrike available, the better thing to do is to trip the enemy or to immobilize the enemy or whatever else, depending on your subclass, and then help your party by evening out the tempo that way. You don't always want to be focusing on spike damage. So this is actually a pressure that worsens your consideration for spike damage, where even if an enemy might be killed by a spike, you might still choose not to go for that option and instead go for a more controlling, safer option. And finally, this is another negative pressure. Is this a circumstance where a single target debuff like Fear or Slow is a better use of my action compression? Or even just not spell striking and just casting that spell up front, is that even a better use? And talking about Spellstrike's spike damage might lead you to this next question. Is it even worth using Spellstrike with focus spells? Is it just bad? Should I just never do it? This might especially be true if you're feeling a little bad for the amped imaginary weapon cases after that not that great showing on the TTK charts. The answer is yes. It is still worth it. It just has an opportunity cost, which is something a lot of people forget when they're discussing optimizing in Pathfinder. Things that just make your damage number go up on the spreadsheet are not the same as things that are strict upgrades all around. If the way you use that thing will sometimes cause your TTK to get worse, then it is a situational option. And it's still a good option when used judiciously and used with coordination, and there will be situations it really shines in. There will just have been costs to get there, including other situations where it doesn't shine. That's all. And lastly, I want to dismiss another common counterpoint I see to this. Magus archetype does not make all this irrelevant. I remember this happened a couple times where I'm talking about how Maguses shouldn't spam spell strikes. They should be using spell strikes more judiciously. And the immediate response I got from that was, well, if you're not spamming spell strike, that means you're probably only using one spell strike a turn, and therefore it's better to be a fighter who archetypes into Magus rather than being a Magus at a baseline. And I'm like, no, that's not true. Because I'm not saying you need to use one spell strike in every single combat. You're going to use two sometimes. You're going to use three sometimes. There are going to be combats where every single turn of that combat, those baseline considerations were met and it was worth spiking the damage. There are going to be other combats where it was 2 times out of 4 turns. And there's still going to be some combats where you did 1 time, but that still doesn't mean it wasn't worth having been a Magus, because if you only did Spell Strike once, why is that? That's probably because you did something like Haste on turn 1 and then entered Arcane Cascade, or something along those lines. Things you could only do as a Magus, not as a fighter with Magus archetype. So no, judicious use of Spell Strike is not the same as archetyping in a Spell Strike and only having the one Spell Strike in every combat. Magus is still the best Spell Striker, and Spell Strike is still the best single target spike damage option in the game. Now that we have learned judicious use of spike damage, the natural next question is, what do I do when I have decided that spike damage is not what I'm going for? And the most obvious question, of course, is, what do I do with my arcane spells? In particular, my spell slots. Now, there is a basic answer that most people will give you. Just use buffs. Cast Haste or Heightened Invisibility on yourself, because buffs don't have an attack roll or spell save DC, so they cannot fail. But in my opinion, this is too risk-averse of an answer, because buffs are tempo negative. They're not flat-out better. They're better in some circumstances, like if I expect the combat to go long, I will probably use Haste on an early turn, and I'll definitely almost always consider a 7th rank Haste, for example, but there have to be cases where you're considering spells that are not just buffs. And in my opinion, the better answer is to recognize that Spellstrike can act like action compression on save spells when you don't want spike damage. This is something that gets ignored a lot, but Spellstrike isn't action negative. I have seen people dismiss Spellstrike with save spells because they're like, why wouldn't I just strike and then use a 2-action spell? You wouldn't do it because that's 3 actions, whereas Spellstrike is 2 actions. This is also most relevant for like a melee Magus because something like Stride in and then Spellstrike with a debuffing spell is a fantastic turn against a boss. And you would need to have been hasted to do that if you were doing Strike and Spell as 2 different actions. And even if you were hasted, I would say striding in, Spell striking with a debuff-based spell, and then using Force Fang is a better use of your 4 actions than, I don't know, casting a 2-action spell, then striding in and making the strike action. It's action compression no matter how you look at it. And people dismiss this because they're like, recharge is like a -1, so it goes back to being action neutral, but you can and should recharge with conflux spells. The reason you have not been recharging with conflux spells is probably because you believed that you needed to save those focus points for amps or whatever. But now that we know we're not doing that, just recharge with your conflux spells. Spellstrike is almost always going to feel like action compression, which means any relevant debuffs like fear, slow, etc. are worth spell striking with. And if you have expansive spell strike, then area of effect spells are worth spell striking with. You can spell strike with a lightning bolt, hit the biggest enemy in the group for a good chunk of damage, and hit everyone else for a lightning bolt's worth of damage, which is good AoE damage on its own, compressed onto your strike. This is sort of your advantage over spellcasters. Yes, you are 1 to 2 points behind a spellcaster's DC, but the reason you're still a good user of spells is because you're doing for 2 actions what would cost them 3 actions, if not more in some cases. So you should be considering these because Spellstrike can compress them onto a regular strike on the turns where you don't care for spike damage. And of course, you're taking on a little bit extra risk for it. In a strike plus a 2-action spell, if the strike critically misses, the 2-action spell can still go through. But in a spell strike with a debuff spell, a critical miss causes your spell to whiff. There is a degree of risk there. I just think that risk is worth it because it's much less risk than a spell strike with an attack spell that you did purely for spike damage, and it's still a pretty reliable turn overall. Like, just as another example, Slam Down is generally considered a good fighter feat. And that's not even a critical miss causing you to fail to trip the enemy. A regular miss on the first strike also prevents you from attempting a trip. The Magus making a debuffing spell strike is substantially more reliable than that. Like, imagine a Magus spell striking with, like, dimensional drop, for example. You're so much more likely to drop an enemy prone and deal some damage, and even if you fail to deal the damage, you might still drop them prone. So that is the better answer for what to do with your spell slots. And of course, offensive spells that you just cast with 2 actions are still also sometimes worth it. This is particularly true for a melee Magus. A turn 1 where you just damage the enemies from afar and draw them in while, I don't know, entering Arcane Cascade or something is a worthwhile turn. And that brings us to the next part of what we do outside of spike damage. Arcane Cascade. How much and how often you want to enter it depends heavily on the subclass. But at a baseline, 2-action spell plus Arcane Cascade is always a pretty good turn because spells are good. Even with your DC 1 or 2 points behind, any spell you do at a distance, including debuffing or damaging ones, and especially area of effect ones, are still going to generate enough tempo and threat that you might draw the enemy in, and now you will have entered Arcane Cascade action efficiently. If you're one of the subclasses like Sparkling Charge or Twisting Tree that really likes being in the stance, you want to build your character so that you're maximizing the chances of entering Arcane Cascade early. That being said, no Magus is going to be able to enter it on turn 1 every single combat. There are just going to be times you don't have a chance to do it. That is just the reality of being a class built around a 2-action spike damage option. That being said, you should be able to work through the inconveniences of Arcane Cascade, especially with the remaster, which I will talk more about in the next slide. Then there are conflux spells. In my opinion, conflux spells should, at a baseline, be viewed as Force Fang. Force Fang is your recharge ++ option. Force Fang is what lets Spellstrike feel like action compression because it bolts just enough damage onto your recharge that recharge feels like 0 actions rather than -1 action. But beyond Force Fang, most of the subclasses have a good amount of action compression bolted onto conflux spells. The most aggressive example is Sparkling Targe, where you have a conflux spell that will let you recharge, strike the enemy, and raise a shield. So not only is recharge not a -1 for you, it's actually a +1 in terms of action economy. And other subclasses have it too. For example, Unfurling Brocade immobilizes enemies on a strike with their conflux spell, and that is a really good thing to have on a highly mobile reach using melee Magus. So Force Fang is the conflux spell that rounds out turns where you're trying to make a spell strike, usually because it doesn't have the multiple attack penalty. And your subclass specific complex spells is how you pull ahead on turns you're not getting to Spellstrike or choosing not to Spellstrike. They are how you mix in continuous damage or exorbitant amounts of control or defense into your turns. And the last part, of course, is your basic martial chassis. Athletics maneuvers or specialty ammunition, basic strikes, skill actions. These are all the things that you will use to round out your turns. If there's a turn you've decided not to spell strike for spike damage with, you might do something like, I don't know, Recall Knowledge a foe or Stride into position, some kind of auxiliary action, then trip them, and then strike them with your conflux spell, doing a bit of damage, potentially getting a rider effect on top of that, recharging for next turn, etc. So your basic mundane martial aspects will round out all of these other gishy and castery aspects that you have going for you. And that is the full picture of how you build and play a Magus at the table. And now let's revisit the remaster changes. How meaningful were they? In my opinion, what the remaster did is took that last slide that I'm talking about, the actual versatile and optimal way of playing the Magus in the flexible manner that it's meant to as a Gish. They took all of that and massively magnified how easy it is to do. I don't think that they have massively improved the ceiling of how a well-played Magus plays. A well-played Magus was always using spells and Arcane Cascade the way I described before. It was just hard to craft her action economy to do so, and there were just a lot of folks in the community who would insist that the only way to play it well was to spam spell strikes, which doesn't really work. A well-played Magus was always doing all the things I listed, but now it's easier to sequence your turns around those things. There were a number of quality of life changes. Arcane Cascade is much easier to use because it is no longer conditional on casting a spell. This is a big boon for melee Maguses. It's really easy to justify entering the stance now and doing other things on the same turn. You won't always enter it on turn 1, but you can often justify doing it by turn 2. And this is especially nice for Maguses that have really good Arcane Cascade bonuses built into their subclasses. Then options like Running Recharge, Fuse Staff, etc. are big improvements for the Magus. Running Recharge gives you a way to reposition and recharge without spending a focus point. And Fuse Staff got a quality of life upgrade. You can now just cast the spells in the staff. You don't have to spell strike with them, which means options like, say, having a Staff of Air for Blazing Dive suddenly became way more valuable for the Magus. So overall, all of these changes means it's much easier to sequence your turns correctly. And of course, there's the spell changes. You have real 2-slot progression now. No longer do you lose your low-rank spell slots. And this is massive. Previously, judicious use of spells was what you use for exceptional circumstances. The baseline assumption in the game was that you wouldn't be casting your slotted spells, or that you wouldn't need to, but that you had the option when you needed it for like an extreme threat encounter, or for like a pathologically bad encounter that's bad for you, like being surrounded by reactive strike or something like that. But now that you have so many spell slots, you can just use them as part of your main toolkit. And of course, the most baseline use case is just you can spell strike more often with them. You can spell strike with more attack spells for the scaling spike damage. Because remember, attack spells, even ones from a slightly lower rank than your maximum, will eventually massively outscale cantrip damage. You can Spellstrike with your debuffs because of the whole argument about them being action compression. You just have more debuffs to do it with. When you're level 5, a rank 1 Fear is a pretty good thing to Spellstrike with whenever needed, and a rank 3 Slow is an explosively good thing to Spellstrike with. And you can Spellstrike with Expansive Spellstrike and its AoE potential much more often. And again, AoEs are something that can tolerate being at a bit of a lower rank than your maximum rank. In fact, you're likely now going to have more spell slots to spare for buffing while also doing all of the other non-buff things that spell slots should be doing for you. And you have new use cases of spell slots, use cases I didn't cover on the slide before. You have defensive reactions like Wooden Double or Interposing Earth or Hidebound that previously were too expensive for you. You have the ability to be more mobile, things like Time Jump or Blazing Dive. You have one-action spells you can round out your turns with. Like, for example, imagine a Magus that has had a turn where they, strode up to an enemy and used a strike-based conflux spell to both recharge and make a strike. Now, their third action could just be a throwaway strike, or it could be a one-action disorienting flash spell, and that would be a really good way to round out their turn. And of course, utility spells, both for out of combat and in combat. When I previously built Maguses, I liked getting the wizard or witch archetypes for all of these uses of spells. Now you don't need the archetype to do that. You could just get that from your baseline progression and you didn't lose any power budget for it. And if you choose to go into wizard or witch archetype, you will now have a spell progression that is so aggressive, it's very nearly what a full 4-slot caster gets. Now, I know that this video has had me making a lot of tall claims. I have challenged the very notion of how the Magus is meant to play, and this notion that has persisted over many years. I think I have given more than enough evidence to debunk a lot of those assumptions, but I will also be putting all of my claims to the test. I will be participating in a one-shot with other creators in the first week of August. The GM of this game will be Professor Proficiency, and the players will be myself, Thraben Yu, Time to Dice, Team Player Gaming, and 20-Sided Ventures. And in this one-shot, I am going to be building an Unfurling Brocade Magus. I am going to be building the versatile athletics-using Magus who doesn't spam spell strikes all the time, who doesn't even have a focus spell strike, who uses spells not just for damage, but also for their utility and versatility and mobility, and debuffs with spell strikes a lot of the time too. I am going to be doing all of these things, and I am excited to see how it goes. Maybe after all of this, I'm going to be like, God damn it, I should have been spamming spell strike the whole time. Or maybe I will convince some of you that this versatile Magus is the way to go. So I hope to see you there. This will not be a live stream. We will be playing the game, recording it, and then just posting it on this channel after the fact. It will be posted within the first week and a half of August. So I hope to see all of you in that video where I put my money where my mouth is. But that will be all for today's video, folks. I hope I have convinced some of you of the way to optimize a Magus. I have always found them to be such an interesting class, and I've always found it frustrating that people only focus on optimizing Spellstrike without looking at anything else. And I hope I have inspired people to look at other directions for the Magus. There's so much depth to the class. Like I said, I think it's the best implementation of a Gish I have seen in any of the games that have the notion of a Gish at all. If you like this video, please like and comment. Every bit of engagement helps. If you'd like to see my future videos, including that upcoming one-shot with the other creators, make sure to subscribe and click the channel notifications button so you know exactly when it gets uploaded. If you'd like to directly support me, consider joining a channel membership or buying something from Crystal Maggie, which I talked about at the start of this video, and have a link for their store for in the video description below. And make sure to use the code Mathfinder at checkout. Regardless, I hope to see you next time. Mathfinder out.